Hello, my name is Jacob Geedy. I am a criminal justice major at Commonwealth University, and I'll be talking to you today about Chinese investment and trade in African oil. I chose to discuss this topic because I've talked about it before casually, but never really took a deeper look into the subject. To cover this whole topic, I'll give a review of the economic history that led to China's foreign policy in Africa, then the methods China uses for dealing in African oil, and finally, what this means for the world's future. Before the late 1970s, just about all of China's economic activity was dictated by the government's central authority. This was a command economy. In addition, the vast majority of commerce and industry occurred within its own borders. That would be called an autarky. So, it was essentially closed to foreign trade. It wasn't until the late 70s that China began to allow civilian participation in a mixed economy and opened up more to foreign trade. Crude oil is very important to all industrialized nations as a vital energy source. Because it's so important, it's the world's most traded resource, as seen in 2022, with a total trade value of 1.45 trillion US dollars. It's important to mention that the world's leading importer of oil is China, with the US as a close second. So, with all that background info out of the way, we can start to discuss China's oil-related activity in Africa. China first started increasing its interest in African oil around the year 2000. In the span of just 5 months, China's oil imports from Africa increased to over 300,000 barrels per day. That's over twice as much as it was 5 months prior. Around the time that imports started increasing from Africa, China only imported from a few countries, namely Angola and Sudan, with 60% of their oil actually coming from the Middle East alone. Today, China's imports come from almost 20 different African countries, including Nigeria, Africa's largest oil exporter. 13% of China's oil imports are from Africa. This shows that despite increasing imports, African oil still doesn't take up that much of China's oil imports. With China's economy boom in the 90s and early 2000s, there naturally came an increase in energy demand. So, China adopts the Angola model. The Angola model essentially is the idea of offering loans and financial support to developing countries in exchange for resources. And the Angola model works because African countries are willing to trade oil in exchange for support in their industrialization and infrastructure improvements. China's oil-related activity in Africa takes a few different forms. The deals made with African countries are carried out by state-owned corporations, however private contractors may be used to help develop the African oil industry, in the interest of both China and its trading partners. For example, the China National Offshore Oil Corporation recently began building on oil fields in Uganda that are expected to be up and running in the year 2025. In addition to contributing to the oil industry's development, China has given loans to their trading partners and offered more financial cooperation in general. What this works to do is further ensure the cooperation of their trading partners in the oil trade. So, we've talked a lot about China's role in the oil trade. We ought to touch on how this affects the African trading partners. China's financial support in Africa has greatly improved the infrastructure of their partners, not just when it comes to the oil industry, but in general. Still, a lot of sources claim that these oil exporting countries are being dug into a debt that they will either find very difficult or impossible to repay. There are some worries that this is by design, and that China is trying to gain leverage over developing countries by putting them into debt. As for China, of course, the country benefits from importing crude oil, like the heavily industrialized country it is. It's important to mention that there have been some attempts to reform or figure out how African countries may repay their debts to China. This could ease some tension regarding that debt. It's also worth mentioning that China's activity in Africa further works to overshadow the foreign trade of the United States, as we'll see on this map on the next slide. On this map, it shows what countries have more trade with China in red and the United States in blue. As you can see, Africa is almost completely red, but if you looked at a map like this, say 20 years ago, it would probably be more blue. China imports more oil than the United States, but the United States produces more oil domestically. In any case, it makes sense that China requires more oil than the US, considering how the US no longer takes part in manufacturing so much. It should also be mentioned again that it is of some global concern that African countries are being put into debt and that they may not be able to repay them that easily. The main takeaways of this video should be that China is an industrial giant and so requires massive amounts of crude oil. While not the world's foremost exporter of oil, that would be Saudi Arabia, Africa is rich in oil and China is willing to invest and trade in its higher risk environment. It's also important to remember that there may be some negative impacts to the oil trade, that being that the debt it places some African countries in might be difficult to pay. Regardless, China has still contributed to developing infrastructures while providing itself with a source of crude oil.